Good morning. I am Reverend Rudra Dundzila. My pronouns are he, his, him, and it's wonderful to see all of you here this morning. I was hoping that we would know the Harry Belafonte hymn. I'm still learning you guys are still getting to know me, and I'm having a hard time figuring out what hymns this congregation knows, but it's also one thing to hear a popular song, a calypso song on the radio, and sort of know the beat of the song, and then try to sing it for the first time. Thank you, Joni, for your help with that. So I'd like to invite you into a guided visualization about our American and Unitarian histories. Just imagine that all of us live in Concord, Massachusetts, 20 miles west of Boston. It's nestled in the rolling hills of New England near Walden Pond. Henry Thoreau fame. Henry was living there. First Parish Concord was founded in 1636, just 16 years after the Mayflower landed. The Reverend Ralph Waldo Emerson is one of its many ministers. Other famous Americans are part of this parish, such as, I already mentioned Henry David Thoreau, also Louisa May Alcott, Little Women, Nathaniel Hawthorne, The House of Seven Gables, and many other people. Our denomination is called Calvinist Congregational Puritanism. It just rolls off the tongue, doesn't it? It's in the Reformed or Presbyterian lineage of the Protestant Reformation. Our church belongs to the Standing Order Churches of New England. Standing Order Churches, that's a powerful name. They are state churches. Each town has one. Congregational democratic self-rule is the bedrock of our religious tradition. We run our own churches and we call our own ministers. We don't accept that an Anglican bishop could run our church for us or appoint a minister for us, or that the British Crown could appoint a governor for us, but we'll deal with the governor another time. Sunday mornings, we and our whole families go to church. Sunday morning services last some 3 to 4 hours with an hour-long sermon. I'm going to fall far short of that standard today. Attendance, thank you very much for the applause on that one. Attendance is taken every single Sunday, and if you are not there, the town council inquires about your whereabouts. Ushers have long poles. On one end of the pole is a feather, on the other end of the pole is a metal barb. They use them to wake up parishioners who doze off during Sunday morning services. I am not making this up. Originally, singing meant chanting the Psalms without accompaniment. But by now, by our age, we have hymnals, we have pianos, we have accompaniment, and potentially other musical instruments as well. That's Sunday morning. Sunday evening, we return for another shorter worship service with a second sermon. We come back Wednesday evenings for a vesper service. If communion is going to be served that upcoming Sunday, that vesper service is a longer service with a long examination of conscience and a confession. And when you're done with that service, you get a token, a wooden coin that you would bring back on Sunday to show that you are allowed to receive communion, and you drop it in some box someplace. There's no offering at the worship services. Isn't that great? You don't have to collect donations because your taxes pay for the church. Your taxes pay for the minister. Your taxes pay for the town council, and your taxes pay for the town school, which also teaches religion. So what if you're a woman and you are called to preach? Maybe you have an innovative teaching, something like that God's grace and love is more important than God's law. What would happen in this situation? You would be tried for heresy in a civil trial and not a church trial. You would probably be banished, like Anne Hutchinson and her followers were in the year 1637. They lived in Boston. This happened to them at their local standing order church in Boston. Another example, in not so far away Salem, Massachusetts, 200 people are accused of heresy. 30 of them are found guilty, and 19 women and men are hanged as witches in 1692-1693. 14 additional women and 2 additional men are hanged elsewhere in Massachusetts and Connecticut for heresy in the same time frame. These were also civil trials. So you might begin to think, maybe I don't like my church. I don't like what they're teaching there. Maybe I want to go to another church. Does that sound like a good question we might have? There are no other churches. Our church is the only church in Concord, Massachusetts. So we don't have a choice. Now, some cities and towns have Anglican churches. They later come to be called Episcopalians. But our Puritan forebears rejected both the British Crown and the Anglican Church. So they formed a separate church, our standing order churches. For this act, they were banished and driven out of England, and that's how they made it to the New World, to New England. Now, here and there in New England, there are a few Anglican churches, and they are a legacy and symbol of British colonial rule. So are they loyal American colonial patriots, or are they basically allied with the British Crown? It's hard to say. So we'll tolerate them, but we won't necessarily trust them. By the way, in the Jamestown colony, which is run by the Anglican Church, our churches are prohibited and banned. We can't be there. Now, there were other churches to choose from at one point, the Baptists and the Quakers, but we banned them. We got rid of them. The Baptists, we banished the Baptists, and they end up in Rhode Island starting in 1636. They're not allowed in our colonies. They preach this horrible heresy that we can't accept, the separation of church and state. We forced the Quakers to leave as well, and they moved to Pennsylvania and formed the Pennsylvania colony, which has this freedom of religion thing going on over there, starting in 1682. The last group of newbies to show up on the block are the Universalists. They appear right before the American Revolution, and we don't know what to make of them exactly, and the Revolutionary War breaks out. The first battle of the Revolutionary War is fought in between Lexington and Concord, Massachusetts. In other words, starting with our own town. After the Revolution, our own church faces its own innovations and heresy. Our minister starts to preach against the Trinity. There is no such thing, the Trinity. Can there be such a thing as a Trinity? A huge debate erupts in the church, and it lasts for years. And then finally, in 1826, the town council, not the church council, the town council votes for the church to become Unitarian. Good, we win the position. What happens to the Trinitarians? We kick them out. They are booted, but they are allowed to form their own church, a Trinitarian Congregational Church in Concord. But we still get the tax dollars. They don't get any dollars. They have to pay for their own church, their own minister, their own school, their own whatnot. This situation happens all over New England, and Unitarianism quickly spreads all over. In some other towns, it's the Unitarians who get excommunicated, forced out, and they have to create their own church and support it with their own donations. Our First Parish Unitarian is funded and administered by the town of Concord until about 1855, 1856. That's when the tax dollars end supporting our church, right before the Civil War, in other words. Going forward, our church has to support itself financially. So we charge pew fees, thank you, pew fees. In order to come and sit in church, you have to pay money. That's how pew fee works. It's not a concept that we're used to nowadays. You know, eventually start passing the basket around like we do nowadays. We now elect our own church council. The town council is no longer the church council, and we continue to call our own ministers. And over time, we become accustomed to this new radical notion of separation of church and state. By the outbreak of the standing order churches, by the outbreak of the Civil War, all the standing order churches of New England and Massachusetts and elsewhere are disestablished. They lose their tax status, they lose their special relationship with the government. That is 235 years since the landing of the Mayflowers. That is 64 years after the Bill of Rights is adopted. And the First Amendment of the Bill of Rights guarantees the separation of church and state. And I quote, "Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof," end quote. So think about this. For some 235 years, some of the American colonies, including New England, including Jamestown, and the fledgling United States of America lived in an American theocracy. Let that sink in. They remain theocracies in the fledgling United States, with slow change happening towards the notion of separation of church and state. And the reason this is important for us as Unitarian Universalists is because one of these theocracies, one of these theocratic governments in the United States were run by our own ancestors in faith, Unitarians and their Congregationalist predecessors, who are now known as, on one hand, the Unitarian Universalist Association, which we are, and the churches that we fought for, the United Church of Christ, as it's called now. Two sibling denominations that came out of that American theocracy. This is our religious heritage in the United States. And for me, this is one of those darker aspects of our religious heritage. So I have a question for you in this election year. Let's do a poll, like Jen was doing a poll earlier. Who wants to go backwards and live in another American theocracy? Raise your hands. Come on, raise your hands. Do we have any takers for an American theocracy? Thank you. Christian nationalism. We've probably heard the notion of Christian nationalism in the media. It's a political ideology that fuses white American and Christian identities. It seeks to create a society where only white Americans of European heritage are privileged by law and society and religion. Christian nationalists claim that they are the only real Americans and the only real Christians in the United States. Christian nationalism is a religious wing of the modern white supremacist movement. Now, Christian nationalism isn't Christian at all. It distorts Christianity. It employs the language, the symbols, the imagery of Christianity, but it's only a veneer of Christian gobbledygook on top of its own ideology. The nation, they keep talking about the nation. The nation is a specifically white nation. It becomes the object of allegiance. Not Jesus, not his teachings, not love your neighbor as you would love yourself. It seeks to compel unity under their chosen political leader. Everyone must obey. All other voices and political perspectives, political opinions are disparaged as demonic. I'm not making this up. They invoke Satan all the time as demonic traitors to American patriotism and Christianity. Christian nationalism is the greatest current threat to religious liberty in the United States. It's also a clear and present danger to our American democratic constitutional republic. Think of some of the religious rhetoric that we've been hearing in this election campaign. So I'm going to go into a little bit of the details of Christian nationalism. Studies have been documented in following it for a number of years. They falsely claim that the United States was founded as a Christian nation. That's essentially their number one big lie. They claim that the United States is supposed to be a white country for whites as part of God's plan. They approve of authoritarian governmental rule as long as it's their authoritarian leader in charge. They fear and distrust and disparage religious minorities, in particular Muslims, atheists, and Jews. We've heard this in the political rhetoric. They condone police violence against Black Americans. They blame Blacks, Hispanics, Native Americans, and Asians for their racial inequality. The victim is blamed for their own victimization. They oppose diversity, equality, and inclusion. We really don't need Donald Jr., Eric, and Ivanka, running these programs, right? That was a joke. It didn't work. Okay. Internally. They feel very uncomfortable. This is a direct quote. They feel very uncomfortable about interracial marriage and transracial adoptions. They oppose same-sex marriage. They fear and demonize refugees and immigrants, queer folks, and trans people. They oppose science education, seeking to replace it with Bible-based creation science. They believe that only men should be public leaders, with women relegated to the role of housewives. And the USA is under siege from Christian nationalism by public officials already in all levels of government. So I'm not making this up, and this is happening in our own Livingston County. Back in May, the Floodgate Church up the road on US 23 held an evangelical Republican, they called it a revival, it was called the Courage Tour to Take America Back. So I wanted to learn more about Christian nationalism. I figured, okay, these people are in my backyard, let's go visit them. I was appalled at what I saw and what I heard there. The controversial Floodgate pastor, Bill Bolin, preached about how God gave him a prophecy to oppose the government's COVID restrictions. And that church became famous for governmental opposition during the period of COVID, I understand. Their keynote speaker was a guy named Lance Wallnau. He's a very charismatic marketing executive. According to the Washington Post, he's become the self-appointed evangelical prophet. He claims that God spoke to him and to others in prophecies, and all of these prophecies said that it is God's will for Donald Trump to be reelected the president. At that point, there were a lot of amens when those prophecies were mentioned in the congregation. Can I get a round of boos, please? Thank you. They both repeated Trump's big lie about the 2020 election results. They both repeatedly claimed that anyone who opposes them are part of Satan's minions. Not the movie about the minions, Satan's minions seeking to destroy the United States. And they never once explained what is it about their perceived enemy that they dislike. They just kept demonizing and painting everybody else very negatively, but never so what is it that they're teaching that's wrong? There was no clarity, no information on that. What was clear is that they are out for a national power grab. With democracy or without democracy, Walno repeatedly stated that a civil war will break out if Trump is not elected. And we saw the first shots of that civil war on January 6th several years ago. To their so-called prophecies, I say, keep your theocracy out of my democracy. Faithful America is a Christian civil rights organization that represents mainstream Christianity, like the mainstream Baptists and United Church of Christ and Lutherans and the Catholics and the Presbyterians, those sorts of folks. So it has a list of Christian false prophets. And this year, Trump and Walno were added to the list of false prophets, together with J.D. Vance, Mike Johnson, Speaker of the House, Supreme Court Justice Samuel Alito, and many others. Faithful America very specifically says about these people, and I quote, "These are leaders who selfishly exploit Christianity for their own personal and political gains," end quote. Faithful America references a Bible quote about their behavior. "Beware of false prophets who might come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravenous wolves." Matthew 17:15. I think that would be a really great quote to remember, and if someone comes to talk to you about electioneering or something like that, use that quote. "Beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravenous wolves." So here at CUUB, we are an IRS 501c3 nonprofit. I am not endorsing or opposing any candidate for office. As a 501c3, we are totally allowed to engage in cause-related advocacy. And the cause that I am advocating for is the preservation of American constitutional democracy. Democratic self-rule is a foundational Unitarian and Universalist principle that started well before our ancestors arrived on the Mayflower. Our congregations since the get-go in this continent were democratic, self-ruling organizations, much in the same way that we are now. So I'm going to lead a 3-session discussion learning program about Christian nationalism on September 4th, 11th, and October 2nd. There are flyers at the doors by the hymnals. Please pick one up. Please sign up so we can learn more in depth and discuss what the threat of Christian nationalism is to our constitutional democracy. Our religious tradition, both the Unitarian side and the Universalist side, have come to this very rational and deliberate conclusion about democracy. We firmly believe without wavering about this belief that an inclusive, expansive democracy is the best form of human governments that any group of human beings has ever created in the history of us as human beings. We have discovered that democracy is the best way to rule each other by time-tested practice. The democratic process is one of our core Unitarian Universalist guiding principles, as stated in our newly recast shared Unitarian Universalist values, and I quote, "We support the use of inclusive democratic processes to make decisions within our own congregations, our association, and society at large," end quote. Democracy. We govern ourselves by democracy, and we believe that democracy is the best form of government for people to have. We haven't come to this conclusion because some sacred book tells us. We haven't come to this conclusion because some prophet tells us. We here in the United States have come to this conclusion through 4 centuries of congregational practice and personal experience. We've been doing this, practicing this principle for 400 years on this continent. We have tested the truth of democracy. We have found its weaknesses. And yet we still believe that the crucible of democracy is the best way for people to come together in right relationships and find ways of governing themselves, of working for the common good, and also for promoting the general welfare as our Constitution says. Democracy is a fundamental human right, and we come together with each other to seek the common good for all. And I encourage you in this election cycle to go out and to preach the good news of democracy to your friends and families and fellow Americans, and remind them what is at stake. And remind them, by the way, we were a theocracy for some 230, 240 years, and it didn't work for us. We don't want to go back for that. And remember, keep your theocracy out of my democracy. Thank you.